Okay, here's a question for you. What do you do when your faith taps out? I'm talking about when you've been serving Jesus for a long time and then all of a sudden you hit a roadblock that you can't seem to get past. What's your next move? I want to use an example that every parent can understand, and if you even like kids, this one's for you. If you had a little girl that was close to death, what lengths would you go to see her brought back to health? Would you possibly humiliate yourself in front of your coworkers if you knew that it meant good things for that little girl? Would you abandon conventional wisdom that everybody believes in to go after something that maybe was a little bit more dangerous but proved to be helpful? Or as in this story, would you throw yourself at the feet of Jesus in front of everybody that you know? Now, what would the consequences be? Well, you might lose friends, you might lose your job, but maybe, just maybe, you would walk with Jesus into an incredible miracle. Now, my name is JD and this is Understanding the Bible. It's where we take small amounts of scripture and mine the gold out of it. I do this so that your relationship with Jesus can get even stronger. And if you'd hit that subscribe button, I'd really appreciate it. It just helps get the message out further. Thanks. This is a story that grips the heart of parents. And the reason I say that is because every parent knows what it's like to deal with a sick kid. You feel helpless. Several years ago, my daughter broke her arm. And now while this wasn't a life-threatening situation, she did put an extra elbow into her forearm. And when we got to the hospital and I was back there with the doctors, I felt helpless because I could not do anything for her by myself. It's really a sick feeling. And this feeling I know, but I only know it to a point. And as a missionary of 20 years, I've seen parents whose kids have been on death's doorstep, and it is a horrific thing to experience. A buddy of mine has a little girl, and before her 5th birthday, because of leukemia, she had spent 2 years in a hospital. I want you to think about that. 2 years. They made the choice that someone would stay with her every night. So it was either mom or dad. And you can imagine what that would do to the rest of the family because the family's never whole or all together. And then you add on the things like the surgeries and the feeding tubes and the different therapies that she had to go through. But the worst part was when the doctors came in and said, "We've done everything we could and we're only giving your daughter a 5% chance of living." Now, that is a place of real anguish and pain. And this is where we find Jairus. He's the leader of the synagogue, and he has a little girl that is on death's door. We're not told too much about what actually happened, but we can reasonably figure out that this girl has probably been sick for a little while. She's probably had all kinds of pains, she's had aches, and now she's on death's door. There's been a lot of chaos that's been going on inside that house. And now Jairus is at the end. They know that this little girl's life is on a shot clock that is dwindling fast. And so this is how the story starts. It says, "And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Come, lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live.' And he went with him." Now, a little helpful background about this is that the religious elite, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes, these guys were concerned with money and position and power. They were supposed to be the people that were looking out for the spiritual welfare of everybody, but they weren't because they were walking in this greed mentality. Now, Jairus was the ruler of the synagogue, and he took care of like the building and the things inside the building, but he would rub shoulders with the spiritual leaders of Israel. And so for him to do something like this would possibly put his job on the line, and he would lose standing in the community because he's going after the enemy of all of the religious elite. Now, when Jairus falls at the feet of Jesus, this is his last chance. He has nowhere else to go. He's tried doctors, he's tried medicine, and nothing has worked. So he's willing to put his reputation on the line, but I want you to think about what it looks like to fall at someone's feet. When's the last time you saw that? When's the last time you saw someone fall at another person's feet and beg them for something? I would argue you probably haven't. And the reason why you haven't is because that is a really uncomfortable thing for someone to do, and then also for other people to watch. And when you look at how this story plays out, it's interesting to see here that Jesus doesn't respond by speaking. He just walks with Jairus back to the house, which means Jesus was listening to what Jairus was saying. Now, inside this story, there's another story. As Jairus and Jesus are going to his house, this woman comes out of nowhere who's been bleeding for 12 years and comes up and just touches the hem of Jesus' garment, and she gets healed. Jesus turns around and says, "Who touched me?" Now, I don't really want to get into the whole story here, but you need a little slice of this to understand. Jesus confirms that this woman had been healed, and then it says she told him the whole truth. Now, if this woman had been bleeding for 12 years, she would have been unable to receive physical touch. Everything everything she would have touched would have been unclean, and everybody would have known about her problem. And that is a lot of pain that this woman would have told Jesus. So I think that Jairus is standing there watching Jesus talk to this woman, and it takes a while. And then all of a sudden, this takes place. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house someone who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" What a horrible message to get from people at your house. You're talking with Jesus, you're waiting for Jesus to stand up and complete the journey back to your house, and someone comes and says, "Don't worry, don't bother the teacher anymore because your little daughter has just passed away." What would be going through his mind? It would have been awful. He would have probably been angry at this woman for taking up Jesus' time. He might have even been angry at Jesus because Jesus wasn't moving with this sense of urgency that Jairus was feeling. But Jesus heard this conversation, and it says, "But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, 'Do not fear, only believe.'" Jesus' message to Jairus in this moment is really short. Do not fear and only believe. Here's my question. What is he supposed to believe in? What is he supposed to believe for? Remember, Jairus' faith is only taking him as far as healing. And now his little girl has died. And so this is a picture of hopelessness. And what does Jesus say? Don't fear, only believe. What's Jesus doing? Jesus is going to do something bigger and stronger than Jairus could ever have imagined for. It says, "And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came into the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw the commotion, people weeping loudly." Now we know that Jairus' faith is tapped out, but what does he do? He continues to walk with Jesus. And it says, when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making such a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and they went into where the child was. Now, at first glance, this is a really strange story because mourning turns into laughing. That's just strange. So you have to ask why. Well, the reason for that is in those days, there was a job that was called a professional mourner. And when someone would die, these people would come to the site where the person had died, and they would weep and wail. And what it did is it gave permission for the family to weep in a proper way so that they could mourn the loss of the person who had just passed. Now, in our culture, it's a little different. I've been to many wakes and funerals where the family is standing next to the casket, and as people enter and kind of go through that line, it's almost like the family is the one that is consoling the person that's coming to the wake, which is really a backwards way of mourning. So when Jesus gets to the house and he says, "She's not dead, she's only sleeping," I mean, this is ridiculous. And if it's anybody other than Jesus, this is an absolute preposterous statement because they've seen the dead girl. They've seen the skin go from pink to gray. They've seen the life exit this little body. It's a terrible thing. And now Jesus comes and says, no, she's just taking a nap. In some ways, you can understand why they would be saying such a thing. But Jesus is going to take control of this situation. And he takes control of that situation by kicking everybody out that's really not important. He has his 3 disciples and he has the parents in the room. And then he does this. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. You know, Jesus does the same thing here that he did with Peter's mother-in-law. Like, he bent down and he just took her hand and he healed Peter's mother-in-law. And here he spoke life back into this 12-year-old little girl. And notice it says that immediately she got up, right? She could get up because she's no longer facing death, but she's also completely healed of the disease that had put her on death's doorstep in the first place. Like, Jesus took care of all of that. Imagine being Jairus in that amount of time, however long it was from the time where he threw himself in front of Jesus to the point where he sees his little girl raised from the dead. Think about the range of emotion that he's going through and the miracle that he just got to witness because he's stuck with Jesus. From hopelessness and helplessness to anger and bitterness to being overwhelmed by the fact that there's people at his house mourning his daughter. And then all of a sudden she's walking around. Like, this is a crazy time for Jairus. And it's a crazy time that shows who Jesus actually is, because Jesus is God. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this. And he told them to give her something to eat. So after the girl is raised from the dead, Jesus gives these 2 commands. And the first one is, I don't want you to talk about this. Now, this is crazy because Jesus is just going to leave the house and then this little girl's going to be alive. I would argue a lot of people in that town would have known that the girl was sick. And then when the mourners came, they would have known that there had been a death. But now everybody is going to be confronted with the fact that this little girl is alive. So people are going to have to wrestle with the fact, who is this guy that came in and did these things? And it's through this way that Jesus is revealing himself. Now, the second way that he does it, he says, give her something to eat. And he says, give her her something to eat, probably because she's really hungry. If you've ever been sick, had a fever, you don't want to eat. This girl has probably not eaten for a while. And then this girl has also died and she's come back from the dead. Turns out doing that, I guess, makes you hungry. So Jesus says, give her some food, which shows you that Jesus is concerned about the physical needs of people. Jesus is just awesome. So in this story, what you see is that Jairus had enough faith to believe for healing, but that's as far as his faith would go. His reaction to that was to continue walking with Jesus, even though he didn't know what was going to happen. He didn't believe that someone could be raised from the dead because up to this point, Jesus had not done that yet. This is the first. And this happens to us today. He says, do not fear, only believe. Remember the little girl that I was telling you about when the doctors said that she has a 5% chance of life left? Yeah, there were a lot of people that were praying that she would recover. And I'm happy to share today, that little girl is full of life and leukemia free. And it's because she was touched by Jesus. My friends went through some really dark days, but they never stopped putting one foot in front of the other as Jesus would lead them day in and day out. So the question for you is, what giant problem, what giant roadblock are you staring down right now? You don't have the answer for it. I don't have the answer for it. But Jesus is saying, are you going to walk with me? Are you going to trust me? Are you going to have faith and not fear? And that's what he's calling each and every one of us to do. So wherever you find yourself in whatever problem, don't fear, just walk in faith. Thanks. And I hope this helps.